too good to be true, doesn't it? Is this the right move? Is it all another consequence of Biden's inflation crisis? What part did woke capitalism play? Vivek Ramaswamy will join us later in the show to break it all down. But we start tonight with the escalating crisis at our southern border. Evening, everyone. Welcome to The Next Revolution. We are nauseatingly familiar now with the scenes of chaos after Biden opened the border to pander to the far-left extremists who run his party. We're also familiar now with the terror for every parent in America as fentanyl flows from China through Mexico and into our communities. But the kidnapping of 4 Americans last week, 2 of them then found dead. And after that, a grotesque, handwritten apology note from the Mexican drug cartel responsible, as if it was some kind of customer service mix-up. All this has shone a spotlight on the cartels, really transnational narco-terrorist organizations who have completely taken over Mexico, infiltrated the Mexican government, and who are now running operations unimpeded throughout America. Here's a map showing where they are active, and yes, it is basically everywhere, in almost every city. This crisis has been building for the last couple of years. Last year, we told you about a drug cartel extermination site just a few miles from the US border in Nuevo Laredo. The US consulate there was forced to close temporarily after it was hit by gunfire following the arrest of a cartel boss. After this latest atrocity, here was the response from the Biden administration, just about as reassuring as you'd expect.
U.S. law enforcement is in touch with Mexican law enforcement. The Departments of State and Homeland Security are also coordinating with Mexican authorities, and we will continue to coordinate with Mexico and push them to bring those responsible to justice.
Continue to coordinate? What are they even talking about? There is no coordination with Mexico. There hasn't been since the Trump administration. Trump knew how to deal with this situation. After his congratulatory tweet to the newly elected Mexican president, AMLO thanked him and replied, "We are never going to disrespect the US government." Under Biden, the great genius of foreign policy, that all collapsed pretty much straight away. Just before our 2020 election, former Mexican Defense Minister Salvador Cienfuegos Cepeda was arrested by the DEA in Los Angeles on drug trafficking and money laundering charges. US prosecutors had evidence that he was taking bribes to protect the H2 drug cartel while directing military operations against their rivals. But soon after the arrest, then Attorney General Bill Barr dropped the charges to try and keep joint law enforcement efforts going. Specifically, Barr wanted Mexico to drop legislation that would neuter cooperation between the DEA and the Mexican military. Mexico agreed to investigate Cienfuegos themselves. But once he was returned to Mexico, Cienfuegos was exonerated, and the legislation, it passed anyway, totally destroying the Trump-era cooperation. Why? Bill Barr tells us in his book, quote, "The driver of events following Cienfuegos' arrest was the US 2020 presidential election. After Trump lost the election, there was no reason for AMLO to continue his cooperation against the cartels." So it wasn't just that Biden opened the border. His election closed down the US-Mexico anti-cartel partnership. And now here we are. While Biden's response has been pathetic, Republicans have been urging a much tougher approach, with legislation proposed to designate the drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, authorize the use of military force against the cartels, and allow assets seized from border crimes to support anti-cartel law enforcement. But when you listen to AMLO's response to all this, you can see how catastrophically bad it's all become.
They want to use military force to intervene in the public life of another country, to invade another country under the pretext of fighting terrorist drug traffickers. After all, it is all propaganda. Nevertheless, we must reject these claims of interventionism.
And then he even issued this threat to Republicans directly.
Nada más. I would like to just tell them that they either change their treatment of Mexico, or from today, we will start an information campaign in the United States so that all Mexicans, our fellow countrymen, know about their aggression by the Republicans against Mexico, and if they continue with this attitude, we will insist not one Mexican or Hispanic vote.
Amazingly, the White House response to the Republican proposals wasn't much better.
Designating these cartels as FTOs would not grant us any additional authorities that we don't really have at this time. So the United States has powerful sanctions authorities specifically designated to combat narcotics trafficking organizations and the individuals and entities that enable them. So we have not been afraid to use them.
Oh, really? And how's that going? What a joke. Cartels rampant, 100,000 dead Americans from fentanyl. Every year, American tourists kidnapped and killed, an ongoing humanitarian disaster on the southern border with no end in sight. What an absolute catastrophe Biden's caused. Opening the border, of course, but as we now can see, helping to enable a war on the border and then doing practically nothing about it. Tell us what you think on the new free Twitter at NextRevFNC and at Steve Hilton X. Let's bring in now one of the congressmen behind some of that legislation, the one to authorize the use of military force against the cartels, Florida Congressman Mike Waltz. Congressman, I just first want to get your reaction to the White House there, totally dismissing the need for any extra tools. They said they got all the tools, they're doing what they can. It seems incredibly complacent to me.
Yeah, Steve, well, this is just more weakness from this White House that have the Russians on the march, China on the march, Iran marching towards a nuclear weapon, and now cartels, these narco-terrorists that control our southern border, that control upwards of a third, according to some estimates, of the entire country of Mexico. Look, I would ask the White House if ISIS or Al-Qaeda pumped chemicals into the United States that killed 80,000 Americans, more than the worst year of World War II. Would we be treating it as a law enforcement diplomatic problem? Hell no, we wouldn't. We would go after them, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, with everything we got. And that's what we're demanding now of the Congress. We're actually asking to give these authorities to the White House. And for example, we're not talking about invading Mexico. That's just a bunch of hyperbole from AMLO to kind of gin up his nationalist base. What we're talking about is, for example, offensive cyber. That rests with the U.S. military's cyber command. We have to give the authority to then use those military assets or space assets, or going after the money with other types of authorities, to dismantle their leadership using special operations forces. There are all kinds of tools that we can use, Steve. We did this in the 90s. We did this against the Cali and the Medellin cartels. We dismantled them. We didn't completely destroy them, but we put them on their back foot so that the Colombian government could then handle it through traditional law enforcement means. That's at the point we're at now.
And do you think that this could be done not just without the cooperation, but with the Mexican government actively opposing it?
Well, look, Steve, I think we're at a point now where we need to send a very clear message, much like Donald Trump did, to say we're going to have to do this with you or without you. We have no choice. We cannot accept, actually under international law, to allow your territory to be used as a sanctuary for narco-terrorists to then kill the citizens of your neighbor is a violation of international law. And I think we send the message that we have no choice. Work with us, or we're going to have to work alone to protect our sovereignty, our people, and our interests. And I think if we send that message the right way, much like we did with the Remain in Mexico policy, then we'll see folks get on board.
Yes, problem is you might need a new president to do it, I fear, but you're certainly, I think, will win a lot of support right across the political spectrum for the strength that.
Well, Steve, we owe it to those families. We owe it to those families to do everything we can do from Congress and at least set the stage for the next president if this one won't ask or act.
Exactly. Well said. Thank you, Congressman. Great to see you as always. Now let's bring in our friends, Fox News contributors Sarah Carter and Jason Chaffetz. Jason, just on the politics of this, I mean, what do you think the chances are with this administration, given their record elsewhere, that they're going to even come close to what the congressman, I think, rightly laid out there as being the kind of level of energy we need in this fight.
Well, they argue that they're actually doing it now. They're providing incentives to come here illegally. In New York City, they're giving them free college and giving them phones when they come across the border. In Vermont and California, they're giving them the right to vote. I mean, there is nothing that this administration is doing to lock down the border, get rid of the rewards and incentives, not prevent them, prevent them from getting amnesty. There's nothing that they're doing. They're providing this magnet. It's killing hundreds of thousands of people every year, and they don't give a crap about it, Steve. Don't even pretend from the podium of the White House that you're doing everything you can. You have more than 20,000 Border Patrol agents. I defy you to find one that says that this administration is doing the right thing. Don't ask me or don't ask Sarah. Go ask the Border Patrol, and they'll tell you we're not doing what we need to do to lock down the border.
Yeah, I mean, that complacency from the White House was extraordinary. Sarah, I mean, you've been right on this story for years, and although we talk, I slightly made a distinction there between the cartels and the attitude to the cartels and then the open border. In the end, the cartels are just so deeply enmeshed in the illegal immigration as well as the drugs. You've been saying that for years, literally. You just put out video, I just noticed, you tweeted it, of these extraordinary scenes just now at the border. I mean, what's your latest on what's going on down there?
Well, I have to agree with Jason as well as Congressman Waltz on this. In 2019, Steve, I testified before the Ohio State Legislature along with Derek Maltz, who was with the DEA, along with Heidi Riggs, who lost her beautiful daughter, Marin, with Chris Farrell from Judicial Watch, to designate these cartels terrorist organizations. And I'm talking about the top ones: Sinaloa, the Gulf Cartel, Los Zetas. Look, they fit the description required by the State Department to be designated a terrorist organization. They must be a foreign organization. They must commit terrorist acts, and they must threaten the national security of the United States. And they do all of that and more. And we're seeing the border right now being overwhelmed with people, migrants rushing the border right now in El Paso, over 1,000 trying to rush the bridge, while the cartels are moving fentanyl in between the ports of entry, not just at the ports of entry, because we know for a fact that our government is lying to us. They've been lying to us for decades. We know that President Obrador is under the strain of the cartels. This is a narco-trafficking state. The state of Mexico is a pseudo-narco state. It is controlled by these organizations. And honestly, Steve, we really have to Pablo Escobar these organizations. That means go back to what we did in Colombia. Go back to the Medellin cartel. Take them down. And I agree 100% with Congressman Waltz. We will do it with or without the cooperation of the Mexican government, because our people are dying. And by the way, their people are dying. And President Obrador should be ashamed of himself, because people are dying and being extorted, being sold on the black market, and children are losing their lives daily. And he should not be supporting these cartels. But it's pretty obvious where he stands.
Yeah, and I mean, Jason, the extraordinary thing about this, I mean, in a way, it's clearly a security policy. It's also a foreign policy question. All these things that the establishment said Trump was, hopeless and couldn't be trusted and whatever. I mean, he did manage to get some kind of cooperation out of the Mexican government.
Yeah, we weren't having these types of problems. If you wanted to claim asylum, you had to stay on the Mexican side of the border. We were building the wall. We weren't having the types of problems with fentanyl. The Chinese were afraid of sending stuff over to us because they knew that President Trump would actually take action. And now you got these cartels issuing press releases. I mean, they're acting like a nation state. Amazing. They're saying, hey, you kill it. These two people, they shouldn't have been killed. They got to ask us. If you're going to kill anybody, you got to ask us. And sorry about that. We took care of it. No, don't worry about it. It won't happen again. Yeah, that's a nation state. Yeah. That's what they're acting like.
Sarah, just time for a final quick thought.
Steve, I mean, this is about our children. Our children are being murdered. Our citizens are being murdered. This isn't about, drug addicts, people that we see, junkies on the streets. I mean, although that's a huge problem as well. This is about pills flooding our communities that are counterfeit pills that are filled with fentanyl. That is a terrorist act. We are being murdered. We need to send a clear message to the cartels that their days are numbered, not ours. And they need to get that message very clearly from our government, and I hope that President Biden does just that, although I'm afraid he won't.
I couldn't have said it better. I mean, and as many people have said, and it's so right, as a result of all this, basically today every state is a border state, thanks to this terrible situation. Jason and Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. All right, now a follow-up to our 2-year special investigation into the origins of COVID. As I always tell my sons, persistence pays off. And we saw that this week in an excellent first hearing of the new House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic, including this vital testimony from former CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield, expertly questioned by New York Member of Congress Nicole Malliotakis. And as you watch this, remember, the world would never have seen this if Republicans had not retaken the House majority. Elections really do have consequences.
In early to mid-January, I did have multiple calls with Fauci, Farrar, and Tedros about how important I thought it was that science get engaged in aggressively pursuing both hypotheses. I also expressed, as a clinical virologist, that I felt it was not scientifically plausible that this virus went from a bat to humans and became one of the most infectious viruses that we have for humans.
Why do you think you were excluded from those calls?
Because it was told to me that they wanted a single narrative and that I obviously had a different point of view.
Okay. In emails following the conference call, 4 of the 11 scientists told Fauci that they all found the genetic sequence incantations from evolutionary theory, basically what you're saying. However, just 3 days later, these 4 scientists had drafted a paper arguing the exact opposite, and that's now the infamous proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. Our investigations show that this paper was prompted by Dr. Fauci, among others, with a goal to disprove the lab leak theory. What is the likelihood that these scientists came across additional information just 3 days after making these statements to conclude with such certainty that COVID-19 came from nature instead of the lab leak that they thought it was 3 days earlier?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. Again, I've said this before, that this whole approach that was taken on February 1st and subsequently in the month of February, if you really want to be truthful, it's antithetical to science.
Thank you.
Science has debate, and they squashed any debate.
Do you think that the paper does hide the truth?
I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September. This was a narrative that was decided that they were going to say this came from the wet market, and they were going to do everything they could to support it, to negate any discussion about the possibility that this came from a laboratory.
I got 20 seconds left. Dr. Fauci was affirmatively told in an email that NIAID had a monetary relationship with the Wuhan Institute through EcoHealth Alliance. He was told this in January 27th of 2020. Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
That is what you call the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. But its customers' cash apparently is safe. As the Treasury Department announced tonight, all depositors will have access to their money tomorrow, with other banks, not taxpayers, footing the bill. Now, this one has a personal resonance for me. Of course, I'm speaking to you right now from the heart of Silicon Valley, where I live. And when I founded my tech startup here around 10 years ago, our early investors all said, go to Silicon Valley Bank, which we did. So I can only imagine the anxiety of today's startup customers there before this announcement this evening. Joining us now to explain it all, and with his perspective, biotech entrepreneur and, of course, recently announced presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek, like I said at the top, this all sounds too good to be true. It's not really a bailout. The customers are going to be fine. Taxpayers aren't going to be paying for it. I mean, what's going on here?
There's no free lunch. And what's going on, Steve, is it's crony capitalism all the way down. What happens is you have a $250,000 maximum that FDIC usually applies as the amount that's actually insured. What they're doing here is they're changing the rules after the fact to favor Silicon Valley Bank. And what does that do is it creates these incentives in the future, Steve, for banks to take more risk, for depositors, especially large depositors at smaller banks, to just throw more money at those banks because you know the government's going to be there to backstop it. I know they're not calling it a bailout, but the concept is really just the same. It's a way in which they've come in to rescue a bank that had horrific risk management controls, and they're also effectively, though, bailing out the depositors here. They're not using the word bailout, but the depositors who took the risk of doing business. When you say depositors,
that's the customers, right? The people who have accounts with them, yeah.
That's right. But those customers in many cases are tech startups, as you said. But a lot of those tech startups did entered a banking relationship with Silicon Valley because they had special business relationships with Silicon Valley Bank as well, including venture debt terms, et cetera. And so the public doesn't participate in the upside of that, but it's a shame to now see the U.S. government come in and rewrite the rules to save them when things go badly.
So is it, I just want to make sure I've understood this correctly. Effectively, the government is forcing all the rest of the banks to bail out the customers of Silicon Valley Bank. Is that what's going on with this?
That's effectively what is going on. This is recent news, hot off the press. They haven't been terribly clear, but if you're reading between the lines to say that they're not going to use taxpayer money to do it, that's effectively what's going on here, Steve. And you know what? I think there's no point to having a $250,000 cap for FDIC insurance if you're just going to ignore the cap after the fact anyway. Yeah. And I think this just creates a lot of incentives behind. What I saw play out this weekend, though, Steve, was a lot of fear-mongering. A lot of folks in Silicon Valley who wanted those depositors to be bailed out. And they started spreading this, you know, I think fear-mongering that said that that's going to create systemic risk in the banking system. Well, you know what? That actually ended up fear-mongering and crony capitalism won the day. But actually, if you wanted to stop systemic risk in the banking system, there were plenty of other ways to have dealt with it. And you can go to see the Wall Street Journal op-ed that I wrote, which we'll put up on our website at vivek2024.com. But I think that it's important to understand the ways in which this was just really crony capitalism, a diet version of 2008.
And it's also a consequence, isn't it, of the inflation that's got out of control, because now you've got the high interest rates that are needed to bring it back under control. And that's part of this story, too.
Well, I think a deep part of this story is the failed Federal Reserve over the course of the last several decades in our country. The Federal Reserve has been playing God, but they're playing God with a fat finger. They haven't been doing a very good job of playing God for the financial system, supposedly balancing unemployment and inflation. That's a flawed construct. And as president, Steve, my goal is actually to return the Federal Reserve back to its narrow mission of restoring the dollar as a unit of measurement. The Federal Reserve has failed for the last couple of decades, but as president, I intend to deliver that. And I think that's actually one of the underappreciated levers to driving GDP growth again in this country. You'll hear the debate about higher taxes versus spending cuts. That's almost the wrong debate to have, because we're not talking about the thing we should be talking about, which is GDP growth. And in weird ways, the Federal Reserve has actually become an obstacle to GDP growth itself. That's one of the objectives that I expect to deliver as U.S. president. And again, more about the agenda at vivek2024.com.
That is a really, really deep point, a really thoughtful one, because a lot of people they're very critical about the way the Fed has behaved, but they kind of think, well, it's supposed to be independent. What can you really do? It sounds like you have some very interesting answers. No surprise there. Vivek, great to see you tonight. Thank you for joining us. All right, so you know how Karine Jean-Pierre is such a great ally of diversity and breaking glass ceilings, you know, everything historic. If you're a woman, if you have ideas that are original, if you want to break that glass ceiling, if you want to challenge the stale male patriarchy, Karine Jean-Pierre is obviously your ally. She will be your champion. She will lift up your voice. She will mock, disparage and degrade you. That's not in the script. But there it was. When asked about a progressive woman, Marianne Williamson, and her 2024 presidential bid, Karine Jean-Pierre decided to, well, in leftist circles, I believe they call this othering.
I mean, if I had what is it called, a little globe here, crystal ball, then I can tell you. But I imagine 8-ball, whatever. If I can feel her aura, I just don't have anything to share on that.
Oh, I found that truly disgusting, actually. Who the hell is this ridiculous laughingstock of a press secretary to patronize and sneer at Marianne Williamson? Marianne Williamson has more integrity, more principle, and an infinitely more substantive contribution to make to our politics than Karine Jean-Pierre will ever have. So Bernie's been out pushing his new book, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, where, of course, he goes on and on and on about the billionaires, but he seems a little confused about things. Watch this exchange.
You highlight something about the sort of paradox or the way that American capitalism has developed over the last 2 decades, which is there are lots of things that have gotten cheaper, right? Flat screen TVs, smartphones, all this stuff, right? The pillar core of what would make a middle-class life, right? That you could own a home, that you could have health insurance, that you could send your kids to college. All those have gotten much, 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 much more expensive over time and harder and harder for middle class and working class folks to reach.
Chris, there is a reason why even before COVID, life expectancy in the United States is in decline. The reason is that tens of millions of working people are living under enormous stress.
Yeah.
They can't afford rent. They can't afford health care. They can't afford child care. They can't afford groceries. And the question again, what this book is about is saying, really, why? Why do we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had in the history of this country? Why, with new technology, are we not creating a situation where all of our people have a decent standard of living?
Bernie, my man, you and your pal Chris Hayes there on MSNBC just made the case for capitalism. The things you guys listed as getting cheaper are the things where new technology is welcomed and they're provided by business. Yeah, sometimes even billionaires. The things you complained are getting more expensive for middle-class Americans are the things where new technology is resisted and they're provided by the government or massively controlled by the government. This exact point was made brilliantly last week by top Silicon Valley investor Mark Andreessen. This chart shows price changes across different sectors. The blue lines are things that are affordable: TVs, toys, cell phones, clothing. The red lines are things that are getting more expensive: childcare, medical care, college tuition, hospital services. As Mark Andreessen points out, the blue sectors are where you've seen private sector competition, innovation, and technological advances. The red sectors have been technologically stagnant because things like education, healthcare, and housing are all heavily regulated, often with the collusion of special interests in those industries. So as Bernie and Chris Hayes and the left ponder this unfathomable mystery of how it is that the free market makes things cheaper, but the government makes things more expensive, guess what they want to do now? Obviously, make big government even bigger. That's the genius idea behind the budget Biden announced this week, with yet another massive expansion of the state. Endless new taxes on small businesses, family businesses, energy producers, just so that in another few years, Bernie can go back on MSNBC and scratch his head all over again about why all these things they've regulated even more are now even more expensive. Here's an idea, Bernie. If you really care about middle-class Americans being able to afford a decent life, change the title of your book to something much more fitting. It's okay to be angry about government. Here with the reaction is Fox News contributor Kat Timpf. What are you angry about, Kat? Government or capitalism?
Yeah, right. I'm smiling, but I am very angry when I hear stuff like this. I hate this idea that it's somehow compassionate to have the kind of view that Bernie Sanders has. It's compassionate to maybe give people money. It's not compassionate to take people's money and then redistribute it because you believe that you know better how to spend it. That's not compassionate. That's being arrogant. And it's just a fact that capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty, market-based systems than any other system in the history of the world. So the capitalist view